So you guys, if you remember, you are going to have a quiz at the end of class. But don't leave your seats till I tell you to, because there will be a mob scene, and then I'm going to put on the slide the door you're supposed to report at, because outside these doors, your TAs will be waiting for you to check off your attendance, and it'll all go with flawless efficiency. Any TA not here? Okay then, I see flawless efficiency ahead. Okay, to begin with lecture 5. We've been talking a lot in this course about the boundaries between magic, science, and religion as phenomena that are co-emergent with the phenomena of modernity. So if these boundaries emerge with modernity, by implication, they were not there in antiquity. So when we looked at that world of antiquity, remember we saw the larger cosmological worldview, why are we here, what is our purpose, where do we come from, was handled by religious systems. And within that religious totality, often you had a series of magical beliefs or arts or practices that were considered to be subordinate to the religion, or certain scientific advances like astronomy and often temple construction would also have been adjunct with within the larger cosmological system of that religion. Now, when we looked at religion in antiquity, the religion of the Greco-Roman world, that was very pluralistic. We use the word syncretistic to describe how basically all the sort of residual civilizations of the last 3,000 years, Babylon, Sumer, the wisdom of ancient Egypt, all of this was in a sort of melting pot of antiquity, making it very eclectic, very pluralistic. So there was a lot of individualistic input in what you could believe. So people were believing all sorts of things, practicing all sorts of spells, worshiping all sorts of gods, sometimes in secret, sometimes as part of a larger family cult, sometimes as part of a much more authorized, structured state religion. But it was a world awash in a variety of beliefs drawn from many different traditions, rituals, intellectual traditions like the Greeks, and even Egyptian numerology, Egyptian secrets of the dead, etc., etc. Now, this vast cosmological worldview is going to focus into the monotheism of Catholicism. So in early antiquity, officially 380 CE, Christianity becomes the official church of the official religion of the Roman Empire. We still have a lot of the same overall structure. Religion is still going to be in charge of everything, right? It's still going to provide the overarching superstructure, how we understand the world, and other philosophies, magical arts, astronomical theories, medicinal theories, things that we could now categorize as proto-science, were also going to be part handmaidens to this larger system. So the church basically takes over, right, this large, vast cosmology, this large system of beliefs and practices, but it tries to stuff it into a monotheistic vision. So it rather narrows the gates of belief. Belief becomes much more controlled from the top down. And that's when we had the early patristic fathers, remember, understanding. They needed the wisdom of the ancients. They needed the astronomy of the ancients. They needed the Platonic philosophy of the ancients. But they had to render it copacetic with Christian beliefs. So it's a top-down structure where information is now much more tightly controlled. But that church of late antiquity, that church of the Middle Ages, still very, very much in charge of the whole picture. But what happened last week? No, today's Tuesday. Yes, last week, Thursday. All of a sudden, we had witchcraft, we had alchemy, we had heresies, we had mass burnings, we had fear of the devil trampling all of Christendom. All of a sudden, this tidy world, this world in which the Catholic Church, which had been the supreme theological force, uncontested intellectually. We get Aristotelian ideas and philosophies coming in, remember, with the translation movement in the 1100s. The church chose to let that information in because it could control that information. It ultimately, through Thomas Aquinas and the medieval synthesis, defanged that potentially vicious dog of Aristotelian materialism and turned it into the devoted pet of the Catholic Church. Right? The term we most use is not devoted pet, but the handmaiden thesis, that science would be a handmaiden. There's an important thing to understand about the medieval church. We look at it as very reactionary and very close-minded. In a way, nothing could be farther from the truth. This church was constantly exposed to the influx of new ideas, alchemical traditions, Aristotelian traditions. And the church, because it was the only game in town, because nobody was in a position to challenge its authority, it had a very loose system of accommodatio. Sounds like accommodation because it is. Augustine, remember St. Augustine? He was one of the early patristic fathers that had his revelation that the truth of Christ is real, not by reading the Bible, but by reading Plato. Augustine had an attitude towards the scripture which was basically, some of this is probably symbolic. Some of this we probably don't really fully understand. So let's take an accommodating position. If two things are in conflict with each other, let's not get all bent out of shape. Let's just say, until we know the truth, let's just accommodate oppositional opinion. So the church, in a way, new ideas come in, the really dangerous stuff has to go. Remember that Cathar heresy, where they're actually calling the God of Abraham, associating with him with the devil? Now, a little too controversial to be accommodated even under this big tent. But in general, reform movements were active throughout the Middle Ages. Ethical reforms, clerical reforms, literary reforms, intellectual reforms, all the time. And they didn't involve or result in the sort of catastrophic upheaval we're going to talk about today, which was the Reformation. So in a way, the church was more flexible, more accommodating. And guess what? If you're in control of the universities, if you're in control of most of the literate population, you can have intellectual knowledge on a very, very long leash because you're controlling it all from the center. But we should see in this outburst against witchcraft, and the vigorous outburst now against alchemy, which in the 12 and 1300s was really just, again, an adjunct science of natural theology, part of the approved investigations of Aristotle, who had been sanctioned by the church. Why suddenly is the church itself trying to slam the door on who has access to the supernatural, who has access to this knowledge? Why are they suddenly saying that must be demonism? That must be Satanism? We should see a profound insecurity in the sense of the church's control. The church now has to keep people out, in a way, from its business. What is its business? Its business is the salvation of society, a very tall order. It is solely responsible for everyone's salvation. That means it is the one that has truck with the divine. It's a miraculous institution. Miraculous through the sacraments, the 7 sacraments of Catholicism, which are baptism, ordination, receiving the host, confirmation, extreme unction when you're dying, receiving holy orders. There's 7 of them. I will mention, I think I have a slide listing them, but But in general, they have these 7 sacraments. Why are they considered miraculous and not magical? Because remember, in the worldview put forth by Christianity, all power, all of this sacred mana is focused in the hands of God. So if some miracle is going to happen, it's not because you were stirring a cauldron and throwing in a couple of eye of newt and compelling God to do it. That would be practicing demonic magic. See the difference? What's the good, nice way to get supernatural things done in the material world? The nice way to do it is through petitioning God. Who are your official petitioners? The Holy Roman Catholic Church. They've got it covered with the sacraments. They'll take care of your blessings. They'll handle the miracles from here. And anybody that's trying to access this magic, direct it on their own, the church now labels them satanic, demonists, magicians. So you see what they're trying to do? They're trying to build their own boundary between who gets to have access to the supernatural and who doesn't. What is a legitimate way of relating to this supernatural energy, and what is a foul satanic way? This is one of our boundaries, an early modern boundary emerging. When does this boundary come up between magic and religion? Babylonian astrologers didn't feel the need to put it in there. But we saw from very on that the Catholic Church, as the Platonic rationalists, were very uneasy about this wild, crazy, impulsive, superstitious world of demons. But this, in witchcraft, in the witchcraft craze, which was basically an accusation of maleficia, black magic, harmful magic, the bad stuff, an accusation against the population of Europe, mostly women, is clearly saying, everybody back to your corner. You are not allowed to have access to the supernatural. That is the sole provenance of the Catholic Church. So we get that boundary, the church feeling so defensive that it needs to push people out of its business. There's another boundary we're going to talk about today, several. We get the boundary between nature and supernature, because we're going to talk a little bit about the scientific revolution as well. Now, who would draw that boundary? Where does that impulse come from? Think about it. The church is already in charge of everything. It's got this cosmology with itself at the center, and it wants to fortify the perimeter to keep people like magicians and witches and Satanists out. But it doesn't want to divide authority between nature and supernature, because right now in the medieval church, the church is responsible for everything. So if they were to suffer a boundary to be cut, their realm of authority, it would mean that someone is annexing their territory. And so the impetus to draw that boundary between nature and supernature in terms of who's going to have authority over these realms, the church had already conceded that God and his creation are separate things. Philosophically, there's already somewhat of a boundary between nature and supernature. God is not to be identified with his creation. But in terms of authority, church in charge of everything. So now, when we see this other boundary we're going to talk about today, trying to wrest authority for nature from the Catholic Church, that impulse is going to be from the secularists, the natural philosophers, people who want to carve out an independent philosophical space from the church. We've got a lot happening here, right? We've got the church trying to defend itself from all this people poaching on its terrain, both in terms of supernature and nature. Third thing we're going to talk about today, the Reformation. The church, in this medieval cosmology, in which it was the uncontested source of ideological authority, you have a deep philosophical question, you ask the church. The church was now, because of the Reformation, because of the scientific revolution, which is just starting to be on a slow simmer in the 1500s, is going to have not only how the heavens go, that's the natural philosophy, you know, how do the how do the planets rotate in their orbits? How do the heavens go? That's a naturalistic question. And with the Reformation, how to go to heaven. So they're being attacked from all sides now. So we are going to enter a catastrophic couple of centuries for the church. A catastrophic couple of centuries which will leave this Christendom envisioned by Augustine, envisioned by Charlemagne as this one great shining city on a hill where everybody was involved in this project of salvation, led by the Pope, shepherded by kings. It is going to be broken and lying in tattered blood and ruins. Through a series of wars, Christendom will be fractured into many tiny, many smaller sects of Christianity. So that is the big picture. It's going to take us Tuesday and Thursday to cover it, but that's the arc. That's where we're going with this for the next 2 lectures. Now, unfortunately, last Thursday we did not have slides, so I was not really able to complete my talk on Hermeticism. So we're just going to step back with Hermeticism, but it's also going to relate to stuff we're going to talk about today. So it is part of our lecture today. And the way it relates to our lecture today is in several ways. Hermeticism, just like alchemy, earlier forms of alchemy, we discussed it being the milieu in which scientific developments evolved. Well, when you read that with the distilling knowledge, Bruce Moran's distilling knowledge, he was referring to the empirical, practical, experimental practices, having a retort, distilling, burning, separating elements, practicing chemistry. That's a physical thing, right? So a lot of the physical investigative practices we later associate with science were really to be best understood in their nascent, their earliest forms as aspects of alchemy. Puts that right smack center in the history of science. Not apart from it, but science is actually germinated within this tradition. But another thing that we have to keep in mind is that intellectually, a lot of what we understand as modern scientific breakthroughs in the philosophical realm, a lot of the ways people like Kepler, people like Copernicus, wrested their imaginations from the Aristotelian lockdown that the Catholic Church had put them in, happened through a Hermetic understanding of nature, which was very Platonic. So we're going to describe that when we talk about the scientific revolution and when we talk about these Platonists. But keep in mind, this is going to be very significant to contributing to the scientific revolution, which we associate with matter, atoms bouncing in a void, with the disenchantment of nature, with the mechanization of matter. But really, its crucible is this, much of it is this magical thinking of the Platonic Hermeticists.
Sorry, the peasants that you were talking about, that last lecture, that the monks called
Cathars.
Yeah, that the monks deemed were witches and practicing witchcraft, and that you said that they didn't have access to the Bible, or they weren't reading it. They were practicing a lot of other stuff.
There would have been already some, like a lot of that was literate nobility. That movement was actually, had a lot of Southern French nobles. They would have already started to have literacy because they're having a kind of commerce and trade. So that is but the people that they're communicating with would have been mostly illiterate peasants.
Okay, but these peasants who weren't reading the Bible, did they have access to this stuff?
No, they're peasants. Their lives are very small. Literally, they don't, that is a hermetically sealed world rather than a hermetic world. Like if you're a peasant, your law is adjudicated to you through your lord on the manor. He probably tells you who you're going to marry. You know exactly what plot of land you're going to be hoeing. there was concern about the beliefs that the peasants would have. That's why they started having stained glass windows. Okay, peasants, this is the basic story. See it in pictures. So this Hermeticism it's intellectual. So we'll talk about more of this. This is for elites, right? Giordano Bruno, Tycho Brahe, these people are not just literate, they are multilingual. They're speaking 5, 6 languages. They are aware of Greek sources, Hebrew sources. This is a super duper intellectual program, and it used to be that the church was the place where you pursued this super duper intellectual program. But remember, once we get to the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s, we not only get this onrush of Aristotelian philosophy, we start getting translations coming in from all over the place. Some of them were this Corpus Hermeticum. These translations aren't going to the Pope's central office to be declared fit or unworthy. They're going to the court of, in this case, Cosimo de' Medici, who had Marsilio Ficino, a Renaissance humanist, translate it. So now the church is not in control of this information that's getting in, that there are rival centers of knowledge, not just little monasteries. Monks are fairly passive. You give them their instructions, copy the Bible. Don't sit around there and discuss it amongst yourselves and make trouble. Universities exploding all over the place. What are universities like? Disputatious, right? People having arguments over certain passages of the Bible. It's explosive. So even though some of this roil and toil and trouble is happening within universities, which are ostensibly controlled by the church, this project, this intellectual project, is unmanageable now. It's just too much information in the hands of too many people, some of them just too rich, independent, not necessarily used to be. If you're going to 900, chances that anybody could read, anybody? Even Charlemagne couldn't read, even though he pretends that he read The City of God and put it under his bed every night. Chances are he couldn't read a word of it. So if you were going to read anything at all, you were already going to be a member of the church. 500, 400, 500, 600 years later, maybe your father was a lawyer. Maybe you're the son of a prince. You might have, your education might have nothing to do with a career in the church. So your priorities are different. And also, the people you're going to obey are different. So this is a very, very different world, and it has to do with turning outward. Europe is rich now. Europe has access to all sorts of manuscripts coming in from the collapsing Byzantine Empire, coming in from their trade with the East. It's hard to stay on the same program. One thing we can certainly say about medieval Catholicism, they were all on the same page, and that page was the Bible, which most of them couldn't read in case they got too many ideas about what was on that page. So now we're flashing to Corpus Hermeticum. We're in 1471. That puts us smack dab in the middle of the Renaissance. So now imagine the changes that have happened. More trade, more commerce, more cities, more princes, more universities, more sources. From antiquity, not just boring old Aristotle, you got the histories, the secular histories. You've got the naughty plays and poetry, some of the pornography. I mean, all of this floodgates, when the church isn't deciding what's in and what's out, it all gets in. And amongst what slipped in was this magical philosophy, the Corpus Hermeticum. I'm just going to read briefly the Emerald Tablet, because I want you to get, just really generally, this worldview. Because we just talked about it being the chrysalis, not just of Western magic, which we can understand in Western mysticism. It's also the chrysalis of some of the ideas of scientists you may have heard of. Sir Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Kepler. So I'm just going to read briefly, give you a sense of what this is about. That which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below. To accomplish the miracles of the one thing, and just as all things come from this one thing, through the meditations of the one mind, sounds like Plato. And indeed, this corpus hermeticum probably came into existence between the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE, people elaborating on already existing ideas, and it's called the Corpus Hermeticum, because these ideas are then attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. But remember, that period is very, very rich with Platonic thought. It's creeping into Gnosticism. It's the time when ideas of the Jewish Kabbalah start to get explicated. We see the earliest references to this Kabbalistic thinking in Palestine. So that's the 1st century CE, although people say it's a much older tradition that goes back to Moses, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that, and perhaps to Adam himself. It's a time when we get Neoplatonist philosophy in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. So this idea about God is the one mind, and out of this one mind emanates the intellectual principle, and out of this intellectual principle we get the ideas that are forms, the shapes. And then also we had Plato's idea of the demiurge. Well, now you have this abstract intellectual forms. How does it relate to matter, to energy, to vitality, to biology? That is through this other principle of pure creativity. Some call it world soul. Some call it the demiurge. It's a loose idea that gets adapted through different Platonic philosophies, so we can't be too specific because everybody's got their own version of it. But the important thing to see is this idea is really huge by the time we get to late antiquity. It's everywhere. It's creeping into all these philosophies, and it's right there in the center of Hermetic philosophy. And also look what this Hermetic tablet is discussing. This, by the way, the Emerald Tablet, was said to have been found in the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus himself. Separate the earth from heaven, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. So you can see them decanting and distilling and burning, doing all that stuff with their retorts and their alembics that I showed you last week. This is an alchemical procedure. It's a philosophical program filled with Platonism, but as a procedure, how do you practice this philosophy? Through rarefication, through separation, through trying to weed out all that is gross matter so that you can get to this refined first creative principle of divine mind from which everything emanates. So if you looked at it as a philosophy, it's like trying to reverse engineer the divine mind of God. Here I am, a magus, got plenty of money, plenty of independence, access to my chemical lab in the basement. I'm going to reverse engineer my union with God. I'm going to start by distilling. I'm going to start by decanting and burning and trying to separate elements. Remember, they're always looking for the lodestone or the philosopher's stone, that pure, pure substance that will render every other gross substance pure. So the psychology, if we were going to look at it as an esoteric religion, is quite simple. So I wrote this down for you. God is the highest heaven or level of reality. That's the one. That's Plato's the good, the one. There's nothing beyond it. And this level of reality emanates the structure and nature of the cosmos as we perceive it. Emanates, that's the very important word. From the one becomes an intellectual principle, an active intellectual principle that emanates or thinks forms. And out of those forms, which might be qualities like justice and love and beauty, things like that, they then articulate and emanate lesser forms until, remember, we got all the way down to the grossest form of all, Norton von Snorton, who was the bulldog, who was the instance of, if you found a physical instance of courage, love, loyalty, but all the way down the chain of emanation till it became embodied in matter and therefore was pretty far from the highest source, the good, the one, but still pretty good. But so you see, an emanationist chain, it's like Russian doll. So God is ultimately locked, immanent within this world. As a practice, like I said, it's an alchemical set of procedures. As an objective, Hermetic magic strives to reascend through this ladder of emanations until you get up to God. Now, here's the problem. Esoteric religion. Well, religion is supposed to be one vast social commitment led by the church. There's supposed to be one religion, one path to salvation, and one church in charge of it. So we start to get these hermeticists lashed to the stake and burnt when we start to get them really adding this philosophical dimension where they're really practicing a religion. They're trying to ascend, they're trying to find salvation through this secret wisdom in a way that is bypassing the authority of the church. That makes them threatening to the church, and it makes them heretics. And it fundamentally disrupts the medieval order. This was another example I gave you guys. I don't want to spend too long on it, but Hermeticists also believe in this magical world of correspondences. And it's very astrological in the way it's practiced from the Corpus Hermeticum. So you see here, you have the human body, and the human body there is inscribed within a pentagram, and what that represents is that each of, not just your physical organs, your limbs, but even qualities. Are you afraid? Are you brave? Are you in love? Every aspect of your humanity, from the gross physical forms to your more spiritual forms, are under the influence of planetary bodies. So therefore, if you're a magician and you're trying to create a particular spell on someone, I want to affect your heart, Venus, I want to make you fall in love. There's a specific metal, copper. There's a specific flower, a rose. There's a specific color, emerald. There's all of these ways of multiply determining that the spell I'm going to cast to make sure your beloved object falls in love with you is going to all be done in a worldview that sees as above, that was the emerald tablet, what's happening with the stars, as below. The stars have an influence not just on our bodies, but on our brains, on our spirits. Every plant is under the influence. So medicinal herbs, every color, every physical feature. Why does that make sense for an emanationist reality? Because if certain forms emanate from other forms, then that relationship of almost their birth would still reside in them. So if there's this higher principle of love, and the planet Venus is an emanation of this principle of love, and then metal, the metal copper, is a further emanation of this principle of love, and then a plant is a further emanation down that chain. All of those things, if you follow the chain all the way back to love, all the way back to the divine mind that first articulated the love. You see what I'm saying? It's a complicated, almost impossible to talk about magic. It's so complicated. But the important thing for you to remember is that it's emanationist, and it's full of magical correspondences that on a intellectual level are understood through Platonism, Kabbalism, Hermetic philosophy, but certainly you would also see it in low magic, or low agrarian witches. If they're using certain herbs, obviously there's going to be a reason for that as well, and it's going to have a lot of the same sort of astrological overtones, but it won't be this worked out, philosophically rigorous program we get from the people that speak 6 or 7 different languages and who have access to this material. There's one other important dimension of this. We talked about the Corpus Hermeticum as a religious program of spiritual purification and ascension back to the mind of God through this intellectual and alchemical practice. But the Kabbalah is also an unbelievably important source for understanding Renaissance magic, Renaissance Kabbalism, and even Western magical traditions today. It too is very, very emanationist. You begin with this highest orb, which is pure consciousness. So the first thing, you can see the influence of Plato in this as well. The first thing, the first sphere that is emanated is super consciousness, the consciousness of God. And out of this comes all the elemental structures, the qualities of the world that emanate from the one divine. So you get wisdom, understanding, beauty, knowledge, mercy, and at the bottom is the kingdom. And you can see here is a Renaissance magi. And what is he holding? The tree of life, the Kabbalah. And he's entering from that bottom sphere, which is the kingdom, the passage through which you enter into a metaphysical understanding of God's divine purpose, God's divine order. You understand God's creation, not at this physical level, but you enter this tree of knowledge, the forbidden fruit, by the way, of Adam and Eve. You enter this tree of knowledge, and suddenly you understand the blueprints of God's perfect order. And you can take that knowledge then as a magi, right, as a magus, and you can act on it in the real world. So it's almost like entering the mind of God. All right, so that's all very complicated. I find this a pretty good example of just how kind of it's clear and wacky at the same time. So I'm just going to give you this one last example because I find this very hard to understand. John Dee, another really famous magician of the Renaissance period, he was actually charged with conjuring in 1555 when Bloody Mary was on the throne. She was the Catholic tutor that was part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So all these people, these magi, were now looking like they were Satanists. But one of the things that he's most famous for is this Monus Hieroglyphica. And if you look at this symbol, he would say the entire architecture, the entire enumeration, the numbers, every principle, every line, every shape you see, every quality you see on this planet is symbolically encoded on this one symbol. If I were to take this, it's almost like you could look at it as a chip or a hologram, and you focused a laser on it. Out of it, all the knowledge that would pop out would be like a holographic, three-dimensional view of the universe. Or another philosopher described it, if you dropped this, remember prima materia, that stuff, that primary stuff under air, under fire, under matter, under water, under earth, the first substance that God fashioned the world out of, if you drop this into a cauldron of prima materia, the whole world in all its forms would jump out, would emerge, because it encodes all of the wisdom. So what you need to understand about this thinking is that it's highly symbolic and highly intellectual. It's not interested in the gross material forms. It's interested in the underlying metaphysical symbols, patterns, numbers of the underlying deeper reality, the creative sources through which God emanated the universe. So I actually was going to read from some of that just to give you a little taste of the crazy. And just, I'm not even going to explain it. You can just go, okay, all right, this is why we're not just studying magic, because we'd be here all day. We see here that the sun and the moon are supported upon the right-angled cross. You see a cross there? There's the sun up there and the moon on top. And this cross may signify very profoundly and for sufficient reasons in our hieroglyph either the ternary or quaternary. The ternary is made up of two straight lines having a copulative center. That ternary is the three lines. The copulative center, I don't need to explain to you. Just go home and look at the slide and figure out what he's talking about. But, okay, giving you a hint. Okay, so he goes on, but basically in all of these lines, if we were to take this world, take this symbol and unpack it, equilateral triangles, squares, polyhedra, all the forms of the world, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, all there. So this is the kind of hyper-intellectual, hyper-obsessive thought that was going on. And by the way, if this is the secret to the universe, what role does the church have? What role does the Bible have? What role does Jesus have? For these Renaissance magi, wasn't that they weren't Christian. In fact, a lot of their symbolism would have seen Christ as part of the manifestation of God's, of the world soul, God interacting, reaching out and interacting with matter. The Son of Man is both man and both divine, so he's this intermediary figure. So there's lots of ways in this Platonic cosmology they worked Christ in. The problem was the Bible and the church, that was the book that the illiterate people, that was salvation for the people that needed saving by the church. These people, these intellectuals, were going to work out their own salvation through the secret knowledge, right? That's what the Kabbalah is. It's the secret knowledge revealed to Moses, or the secret knowledge passed on to Adam. So all of this is a secret, hidden tradition that only an intellectual who had access to, by the way, these texts now pouring in, remember, from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Byzantine Empire, coming up through Spain, which used to be part of an Islamic caliphate. So this is all stuff that was originally locked out by the early patristic fathers and by Charlemagne, all coming back in. Return of the repressed. So now we're going to switch gears. That was the magical thought coming in, right? Coming in, a lot of this stuff comes up through Italy because they have those eastern-facing ports and are doing a much brisker trade with the East. So Italy is going to be the center of a lot of these Renaissance texts. A lot of the Renaissance is associated with history, philosophy, secular thought, urbanization. But Christian humanism, which is also part of this Renaissance movement, is specifically associated with a specific kind of text. These were the original Christian sources. If I say original, that's not true, because we don't have actually, the handwritten first copy of the New Testament. But let's say sources of the New Testament written in Greek, written in Hebrew, some of these as old as the 2nd century CE, stuff that is in much better shape, much pure, much more authentic form than the stuff Charlemagne got his hands on in 800 CE. And then think about it. We've had now, 600 years of monks hanging out in monasteries, copying the same page over and over again. At what point on their 100th copy do you think they started making mistakes? And then their mistakes were copied, and those mistakes were copied, and so on and so on. Until by the time you get to the 1400s, you had versions of the Latin Bible that were encrusted with commentary. Monks scribbling in the margins, trying to figure out what does that word mean. And by the way, these were people who did not have access to Greek. The medieval world was a Latin-speaking world. But the earliest sources of the Bible, those were written in Greek, and of course the Old Testament in Hebrew. So this was already a world that was going to have translations of translations of translations. And so now, when we get these new texts coming in, the original Greek sources, and they're not only the original Greek sources, but we get Greek scholars coming in with them. So now all of these Italian humanists can have their own Greek tutor and learn how to speak Greek. And lo and behold, they start translating. They start doing things like creating critical editions of the New Testament, where you'll put the Greek version and then the modern Latin version side by side. And it became painfully apparent that a lot of what the church was preaching simply had no basis in reality, that the scriptural basis of the church's authority was riddled with errors and mistranslations. And not only that, there's something deeper, more disturbing that happens. It's not just, oh, you mistranslated. This is really an existential threat to the Catholic Church. Because if you look at the New Testament, nowhere in it does Jesus really say what his church is. He says Peter's going to be the rock of his church, but he's not. Is the church just the people? Where does it say it's this institution, this landholding institution that's going to be in charge with anywhere between 30 to 70% of the arable land, collecting rents? Where does it say that the church is this powerful institution? Where does it talk about priests in the New Testament? I mean, why aren't we know we have apostles, but where does it say that the Roman Catholic priesthood are actually going to be the heirs of this apostolic mission? I didn't know, according to the New Testament, that this was a hereditary position, that Peter's position was hereditary, or that the apostles' position was hereditary. So you see, the whole premise of the church is that they're in charge of your salvation. And the things that are authoritative with the Catholic Church, the Bible is absolutely authoritative, but that's not the only thing. What else is authoritative? Stuff that laws, canonical interpretations passed by the church synods, anything the church fathers wrote, from Aquinas to Augustine, all of that is also considered additionally authoritative along with the Bible. Decrees by the Pope are considered authoritative. Do you see what I'm saying? You're getting a lot of extra stuff going that is considered to be fundamentally necessary to your salvation, the stuff that really the church uses as the premise for all of its earthly power. And suddenly you have people reading the New Testament and able to see that not only are most of these sacraments not in the New Testament, like when are you supposed to, marriage is not necessarily a sacrament, there's no extreme unction, there's no confirmation, there's clearly the sacrament of baptism, get John the Baptism and the breaking of the bread of the Last Supper, but a lot of these sacraments don't seem to have any basis. And again, think about it. Remember that, we talked about at the beginning of lecture, that sacramental magic, well, call it miracles, was the thing that the church used to mediate between the faithful and the divine realm. So it was the way the church took this otherworldly power and made itself effective in the real world. But hold on. If God doesn't say anything about these sacraments in the New Testament, then what are the priests doing? They're taking magical powers and directing them in this world in a way that seems like dark magic. This is where you get this new critique of the priesthood, that they're acting like a bunch of sorcerers. The priests are Satanists, sorcerers. At the very same time, we might note that the Catholic Church is busy saying, no, no, we're not the sorcerers and the witches, they are. So you see that this is an accusation that erupts from a very profound place at the center of the church's uncontested authority and what it means. What is the church? What is legitimate access to the supernatural? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? What does it mean to be saved? Are you doing it right? And if you're not, now that we're asking these questions, you also open the question, what does it mean to be damned? And that's when we have these persecutions and all of these heresies. So there is a sense then that the church is profoundly under attack. We've all heard of Martin Luther. He nails his 95 Theses up on the wall in 1517. But let me just say that everything he puts on there is a critique the church had already heard. The church was a flexible, in its own way, progressive institution. When it came up against a really bad critique, usually it would form a new monastic order. Say they get a lot of criticism for being so corrupt. Form a new monastic order like the Franciscans that are dedicated to poverty. So, I mean, the church just became a very, very complex institution that had something for everyone, right? For the poor, you have the Franciscans. For the intellectuals, you have the scholastics. And yet, it had been able to survive many of these critiques. The famous ones, of course, are sale of office, the marriage of clerics, the overall, like the corruption and the wealth with which the church is associated. These had all been heard before, but something has changed. We talked in the beginning of lecture that used to be the church was the only theological game in town, the source of intellectual legitimacy even for the kings, ruled through a divine right. So their legitimacy was very much tied to their Catholicity, right? So you had a world that could afford to be this pluralistic, that it could afford to say, oh, you know, you're right, we are wrong, we need to work on that. But the world that Martin Luther, when he nails his 95 Theses up, and he does, by the way, does not know he's starting a Reformation. He's just a very religious person who, in the tradition of medieval reformers and the tradition of scholastic intellectuals, is going to nail up 95 proposals. I think you are doing the following 95 proposals wrong. I would like to discuss each of these with you, very scholastic method, inviting whoever the church's representatives would be to a dispute. He's trying to reform and perfect the church through scholastic dispute. But what ends up happening? He ends up becoming a catalyst for major, the political motives of the German princes. Luther finds himself an army and princely patronage because this is a world that is ready to split. This is a world where secular power and religious authority, which always coexisted uncomfortably, are now really at a point where they're ready to be broken apart. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, before we get back to the politics of it, I'm going to talk a little bit about his critique in a larger sense. We already talked about the priests as sorcerers, which is also covered under the occult ritualism. Exactly what is the priest doing when he sprinkles holy water on the fields and blesses them? What is going on there? Is that a shamanic ritual? Is that really divine intercession? Or is that some kind of occult ritual? We've talked about the venality, the worldliness, and corruption of the church because basically the church was infiltrated very early on by the nobles. The nobles wanted that land. The nobles wanted those titles. This was a powerful, prestigious body. The first estate is the church. The second estate is those who fight. First estate is those who pray. But together, who are they? Those who rule, those who own, those who make decisions. And they exist together in this medieval framework. Those who pray, those who fight, and then everybody else, those who work. But they exist uncomfortably because it's never quite sure, well, who's really in charge? Is it the Holy Roman Emperor? Is it the king? Or is it the Pope? Who's really the head of Christendom? So this fight was always brewing, but at the same time, since the church and the aristocracy were intermarried, intermingled, they were really one class in terms of aristocratic birth, they had enough interests in common that they held this world together. But when you think about it, when the poor people are watching these bishops ride through town, these are noblemen. We're used to being raised in palaces, and now they're dressed like noblemen, but noblemen of the church. They're wearing gold. They're wearing these gold embroidered mitres. You've seen those gigantic crowns that they wear on their head of gold and silk and precious cloth. So this is a world where the wealth of the church is in everybody's faces all the time. So the church is very vulnerable to this critique. But there's something else going on here that's really interesting, and that is the sale of indulgences, called simony, right? So the idea that you can pay me money now, I'm the church, you can pay me money and I will arrange for your forgiveness of sins. Now this sounds like just ghastly corruption on the part of the church. But if we really understand what's going on here with this simony, we understand it's a symptom of a far deeper change. Who do you think wants to pay for the forgiveness of sins? A new class, a merchant class that is demanding a new kind of service from its church. So this is actually driven, this sale of the simony, the sale of indulgences, simony I think is it's the sale of offices. So this is the indulgences are different. So the sale of indulgences is driven by this merchant class who's thinking in a brand new way. They're thinking in a way that time is money, right? While I'm alive, I can make money. While I'm dead, I can't make money. But I can hire people to pray for me while I'm in purgatory and then pray for my soul to go to heaven, or I can pay for people to do good works. So in the end, in a very cost-effective way that doesn't hurt my bottom line, I will still get to heaven. This is new, this is nascent capitalist thinking. And it comes from a new merchant class that has to be involved with money and cash and trade and commerce and all that banking stuff all that stuff that in the medieval worldview, that's worldly, that's materialistic, it often involves usury. You're explicitly not supposed to be into all of this stuff that merchants are into by medieval standards. And yet, here you have a new class standing outside this medieval world, the class that will ultimately bring that world down to its knees, the class that will inherit the future, that's us. But they didn't belong in this world. So they had to figure out a way of making this work for them. So it's a symptom. This whole idea of the sale of indulgences is not just to be understood as the corruption of the Catholic Church. It's to be understood as symptomatic of a profound form of social and economic class change that is already the writing on the wall. This medieval world is done. Those who pray, those who fight, those who work, where's those who buy and sell? They're going to be inheriting the future, and they will be driving much of the Reformation. Now, what is clear in the New Testament, and what becomes the rallying cry of the Reformation, what is perfectly clear in the New Testament? There's one way to get salvation. This is the whole point that Jesus makes clear. There's one way to get salvation, and that's through me. That is through belief in me, Jesus Christ. That's how it is done. And anything else is not salvation. So if you want to get saved, there's no mention of priests, there's no mention of sacraments, there's no mention of a church, there's mention of faith. So the rallying cry of the Reformation, I'm just going to say, becomes sola fide, by faith alone. That means sidestep the church, go straight to Jesus. Where are you going to find the word of Jesus? How are you going to understand and come to Jesus and hear his words? The New Testament, or the Bible, for if you want to hear the words of God, not church commentary, not something produced from the various church councils, not Thomas Aquinas, the Old Testament or the New Testament. So the second rallying cry of the Reformation, sola fide, by faith alone, sola scriptura, by the Bible alone. Wow, that is an end run around the Catholic Church. That's why this is an existential threat. This is not saying the church is doing a couple of bad things wrong, like they shouldn't be sleeping with their parishioners, or they've mistranslated a few things, or why are they so darn rich. This is saying, on an existential level, you shouldn't exist. There's no real precedent for priests, for most of these sacraments, certainly not for a pope. And what is much of the Reformation, especially the more radical sects like Quakers, where it's just a group of friends and there's no church hierarchy whatsoever? A lot of the churches do retain some kind of priesthood or hierarchy, but it's different. They're understood as sort of, they're assisting you in your salvation. They're not considered a sort of special anointed brotherhood. Think about it, Catholic priests actually, through a sacrament, one of the 7 sacraments is ordination. So through this sacramental magic, where the force of God is channeled into this holy sacrament, the priest is blessed and becomes part of a special order so that he can represent God's divine mission. He has special access, special status. The Reformation gets rid of ordination as a sacrament. So if we have priests in this Reformation, they're not considered these almost shamanical, magically anointed beings. Also, we have a new class that we talked about. It's this merchant class. Merchants need to read. They need to read because they're oftentimes might be suing each other. They need to understand the law. They're often writing letters because they need to conduct matters of trade and matters of finance. This is a literate class. They're reading a lot, but they're probably not that interested in reading some lengthy treatise on nominalism or the nature of the Trinity. They're going to be interested in other types of texts and literature. But there's also part of this movement, this new independent class. Remember, we're still living in a world that can't imagine godlessness. Now, these people might be breaking out of a medieval mindset, but they still live in a God-centered world. But now they've got to figure out how to get to God in a way now that the church has been proven illegitimate, possibly in some people's minds, critiques, satanic. So the Bible and having access to the Bible becomes hugely important, and it is no mistake. All these things converge at the same time. We get a printing press. That means if you want a Bible and you're reasonably well off, you can afford to buy one, because printing a Bible is a heck of a lot faster and a heck of a lot cheaper than having one transcribed. Bibles used to be for the wealthy alone. That's why they would show up in the church on a chain, because it was an extremely expensive and difficult document to produce. Now that you get the printing press, literate people, people of intermediate means, can now start to read the Bible, and they do. And quite frankly, this class, oftentimes this merchant class, don't find their interests represented by the church, so they're very open to this new kind of learning. All of these Protestant faiths that we're going to see arising, they share certain things in common. So I already emphasized a lot of them. They reject most of the sacraments. Depending on the sect, they'll reject all of them, or some of them keep. They keep baptism, and they keep the sacrament of the host. They reject the priesthood, as we discussed. These priests are no longer ordained through the miracle of the sacrament of ordination. Salvation through faith, not works. So that means Jesus was quite explicit. He didn't say, look, either believe in me or go down to the local orphanage and feed a bunch of orphans, and then we'll call it even. No. Jesus said, believe in me. So good works, that's really great. You're manifesting your Christian spirit. I'm all for it. But salvation is really clear. It's through faith alone. Predestination, baptism, communion, all of that. Predestination, of course, is if God is all-knowing, wouldn't he know whether you're damned or saved? This becomes a new... The Protestants soon find out that it's not that easy to run a theology. You actually do need a bunch of intellectuals sitting around and thinking about it and disputing and adding all these accretions to the New Testament. So they get themselves in the same not quite as deep trouble as the Catholics, but it's very difficult to remain pure. So all of these divisions come up because we don't have one Protestant church, right? We have many, many different Protestant churches because theology is a very difficult thing to work out. Many of them reject the use of images. Why? Well, this was a point of profound consternation. By the time we get to the sort of late medieval, early modern church, the Catholic Church had created an accommodation. Remember its spirit of accommodatio? That wasn't just intellectually for concepts of Aristotle that didn't quite fit. It was also an accommodation with the peasantry. When Charlemagne moved in to conquer by the sword the Germans, he found it very, very difficult to bring Christianity to people by the sword, although he did try. Ultimately, Christianity was successful because it found a way of assimilating local belief systems, replacing the things that people got from their old beliefs, right? So if you had certain festivals, certain I won't call them demons, but certain polytheistic gods that provided you with certain kind of patronage, certain kind of support or wisdom or assistance, we get a proliferation of saints now. My grandmother used to pray to St. Anthony when she would lose stuff. And you know that you can pray to St. Martin if you want there a business deal to go well. I mean, all of these saints have these sidelines where they will be intercessing on your behalf, using their particular patronage to represent you. Now, if you think about that, that sounds an awful lot like peasant polytheism. You pray, you make a sacrifice to a local deity, and that local deity will either work something out for you on your behalf with a greater deity or perform the service themselves. But the peasantry can't live without this is a shamanic culture. They can't live without all this magical intercession. They can't live without the festival of the Maypole and the feast of, all these feasts become Christmas and the Feast of the Assumption. All of this Catholic liturgical calendar, the saints' days, the feast days, it all gets mapped on to an underlying agricultural system of rituals and beliefs. Syncretism. They joined forces, but this means that at a grassroots level, the church really never stamped out magical beliefs. Why? Magical beliefs made them powerful. For people to understand, for peasants to understand that the priests had access to this kind of supernatural power, for peasants to believe that the blessing of the priest gave them a special dispensation with God, to believe that blessing their fields or blessing their animals brought God's favor. These are ancient, as deep as humanity itself. And for the Catholic Church to succeed at the profound level of success it had, right? Recruiting this European peasantry to Christianity, it did so by going wink, wink, nod, nod, to a lot of their magical practices, magical beliefs, magical appropriation of the saints, worshiping things like bones and relics and pieces of skin and hair. That's like magic, right? It's sympathetic magic. Now, a lot of this rejection of images was trying to find a way of rejecting what was absolutely seen as this polytheistic proliferation, this worship of false icons, this thinking that statues or pieces of a saint might actually have magical physical properties, because that smacked of the old magic, right? So this was something that when people were reading the New Testament and becoming very purist and very fundamental, there was no place for this peasant magic and this priestly magic in the Protestant vision. Politically speaking, just to make things simple, European princes, after all the trade, the burgeoning cities, the new kinds of armies, peasant armies, people that were not just a collection of knights on horseback, used to conduct most of the war. And if a king wanted to fight a war, he had to get the help of his knights. By the time you get to the late 1400s and the 1500s, warfare's changed. Now kings have money, right? Because all that trade and all those taxes they're collecting and all those cities that are now a source of power, they are commanding huge armies now. They don't have to worry about their presence. I mean, they're nobles. They're about to pull the rug out from under their nobles. And quite frankly, they are ready to take on the church itself. Now, back in the day, when kings were relatively weak compared to their nobles, they weren't in a position to take on the Catholic Church. They needed the Catholic Church to, buttress their claims. But now that they've got all the money rolling in, all the power of the military, of the law, they're getting these bigger and bigger bureaucratic apparatuses. This is the moment. It is no coincidence. This is the moment where they find Martin Luther, who could easily just ended up being a nobody we never heard of, or somebody who started a small Reformation movement. And who knows, the church might have said, Martin Luther, you've got a point. We'd like to, why don't you form your order of the monastic Lutherans? And this could have just been a minor monastical movement within Catholicism. But that wasn't the world they were living in. This was a world that took Martin Luther's heresy, gave it an army, gave it kings, gave it countries, gave it bureaucracy, took those heresies and turned them into religions. And that's what drove the Reformation.